Good afternoon, everyone. Late morning here on Saturday, and about a day late in getting this to you, but hope you have time to watch this and get a quick orientation to what we'll talk about tomorrow at our Sunday gathering in the morning, our gatherings, I should say, as we meet in simple churches around the campus and continue to talk about the churches of the first century. How did they meet? And what was unique about them, and how is that connected to the way in which they not only became strong and grew and multiplied and became a network of churches from Jerusalem all the way to Rome? That's the story that the book of Acts tells. And last week we were looking at the connection, the main idea that the connection of the creation of that network that we see across the story of Acts, that Jesus intended and set in motion and continued to do through the apostles by the leading of his Spirit, has two key components. It is meant to grow and multiply, but that depends on what happens at the smallest level of church life and the church existence, what it is, does, and how it acts. Number of ways of saying that, but there is something very much connected to Jesus's mission in the world with the way his church sees itself and acts together, and as we'll see today, how it gathers together. We're putting that picture together because that picture is the one that the New Testament gives to us. We don't need to find another picture. We're not free to create other pictures or other stories or other models. We need to work with the one that's been handed to us. So that's the understanding that we're working from here. That's the intention, particularly in Acts with Luke, that go and do likewise in a way that's appropriate to this teaching story, this teaching model that I presented to you as a follower of Christ, because this is what Christ handed on to the apostles, and they went out and did. And we have their writings, and we see the things that they did and the way they did them, and we can build a contemporary model today for how we ought to work, strategies and tactics, down to some very, very particular details like we're talking about today, and we'll continue to talk about, in order to see the kind of fruit that they saw there in that first century. That plan is in place, and the expectation is that every generation will engage in it, and every believer and church and leader until Jesus returns. So just to put some of those out there at the beginning, so that we're just continuing to understand why we're talking about these things and why they're so important. They're important in the larger context of the plan of Christ. We're talking about the particulars of the plan of Christ, the details of the plan of Christ, and what we should be oriented to today. And we start also just getting into things that begin to conflict with what really comes down to a matter of personal preference, as opposed to Jesus's plan. We have to keep both of those things in mind and not assume that the things that we're used to, or the things that we've come to understand as in our understanding of what it means to be the church, are not just merely matters of personal preference or things that have been handed on as if that is the way it's always been. We're looking back at the way it really truly was in the first century, enough so that we can shape our lives and shape our work around that too. So just to keep those things in mind as you read through these, to make sure that you're engaging with them in a relevant way, that it's not just something we're doing week to week because we don't have anything else to do. We have lots of other things we could do and teach on. But these things are important because we want to find ourselves in the place of maximum effectiveness and fruitfulness for the kingdom of God. And that's going to be according to Jesus's plan. And the plan is there. We're there to understand it and then to envision, as I've titled this series, what that looks like. So let me screen share with you and walk through some of the main ideas. This is running from page 11 to 19 in the small booklet that you're all using. So I will keep my screen up there at the corner. You should be able to see me as I do this. But again, as I've titled this, understanding the churches of the first century and envisioning the future of the church today. I'm drawing on the work of others, particularly the global network that we are a part of in partnership with BILD International, the work that I'm doing in Albania, Kosovo, Holland. And by the way, I will be leaving for Holland and Albania next Monday, just after our Lord's meal on the 11th. So I appreciate your prayers as I have a week to prepare for that and do a variety of things. I'll talk more about that around our Lord's meal together on the 10th, where we'll be all together as we celebrate our new life in Jesus in the manner in which we're even talking about today and which we're already used to. But I'm also talking about envisioning the future of the church today. And in our case, it's particular to Grace Church. I've entitled this segment session of our teaching through the encyclical, The Meal at the Heart of It All. That's what the focus is today. Just a recap on the book of Acts and how we're to think about it. And this is from last week. The book of Acts clearly establishes a connection between these small, authentic gatherings of believers and their multiplication and spontaneous expansion. What's happening in the smallest part affects the multiplication and growth of the biggest part. As the Lord added to the numbers in the first church in Jerusalem, each of the 6 progress markers or summaries in Acts shows the Lord adding to the progress of the gospel through the multiplication of these churches. So the progress markers are these. So I'll leave this slide up, and we've talked about this before. You've seen me talk about it before, but I hope it's making more sense to see that when you read through the book of Acts, you see these summary statements or markers. And this tells us that Luke has written his account in this way and this is part of the way that he's designed his writing, so that the reader notices those things and makes sense of the whole thing that he's writing. Why did he select these things? Why did he talk about this and not talk about that? And 6 times he stops in his writing and makes this big summary statement. We talked about it on Thursday night, but I encourage you to go and look at them yourself and read them one right after another. Go right through Luke. Start at 6-7. Go start at Acts 1:1-8, the preface there, and then jump to 6-7, then jump to 9:31, and then to 12:24, and just watch how the flow happens. He summarizes the gospel's progress in these things. He's summarizing or basically giving you the indications of how spontaneous expansion is happening. Look them up and reflect on how they track or record the spontaneous expansion of the first churches as Luke's intended purpose. It's what he's written Acts to show this progress and then how it happened. So the things that he writes from 1:1 to 6-7, he's giving you clues, keys to things that when these ingredients all come together, boom, here's what happens. And then between 6:8 to 9:30, when these ingredients come together, it continues to grow, and he adds more elements to it. So it's a growing progression through the book of Acts. It's important that you understand that that's what it is, not merely a history lesson to describe what happened, but put together in a careful way to show that these things happened and it led to this and this and this. And so you can build ministry anytime and all times until Jesus comes again, built on, around this framework, this model that Luke gives us through the historical unfolding of the church and the progress of the gospel in the first century. So Luke's highlighting things that he's selected in each one of these panels, 6 panels, you'll hear us refer to that from time to time, are the stuff. Those are the things that happened, and the work of the Spirit and leaders and churches and unplanned circumstances and even persecution, that then when they all came together, this is what God did. And so we need to think in those terms, and we need to put our own lives and ministries in those terms today as well. Oh, what would that look like? What should we be doing? And then what could we expect to see happen and be ready to respond and adjust to as believers, churches, leaders as well? Important ideas right there. The second thesis or big idea, this is an idea that grows out of the main idea of last week, is this one. Okay, we're going to get down to the particulars now of the small, simple gatherings. The meal was at the heart of these small, simple meetings that fed the spontaneous expansion of the early church, a concept that began in Acts 2:42 with fellowship and breaking of bread from house to house. The concept of the meal was fully developed in Paul's instruction about the Lord's Supper, as we've come to know it, to all the churches, an ingenious branding of churches worldwide. So I want to unpack this a little bit, and you'll be doing that through the reading, and hopefully you've already done that in a couple of times. Page 11 through 19 there of the small booklet. I believe it's 52 through 57 for those of you who have this large, the large bound version of all the encyclicals. But we first, I'm tracking again. These are slides that I've used in relation to the reading that you have. So the author of the paper has actually prepared these slides. So I'm working with that set here with what Jeff has put together. So these are not my ideas of just pulling them right out of the paper, and I'm trying to highlight them as he tries to in the reading. But the first thing to do is to establish the centrality of the meal. Why the meal? What's so important about that? And why then should it still remain important in the way Christ's church sees itself and operates today? It was central in these small churches. And there's a high probability. It's very, very hard through all the research to see how this was not happening in every situation. Besides meeting in homes, we know that for sure for the first 300 years, they probably had a meal at every Sunday evening gathering. They broke bread at the beginning, which formally began the meal, and the term that was used to speak of the whole gathering, just like Luke says in Acts 20, when we gathered on the first day of the week to break bread. Break bread was the way of describing everything that was happening. It's not just about the food they were eating. It's the way they described the whole meal. Oh, we're going to break bread. Oh, what does that mean? It means we're going to have a simple gathering with a whole bunch of stuff in it, but we refer to it, breaking bread is kind of a suitcase that I carry the reality of that whole meal around in, so I can refer to it. I don't have to explain to you everything. I use a word and it assumes all the other stuff that's happening in the meal. It's an important idea too. And then they pass the cup at the end. Some quotes from, again, research that's been done, and this is sprinkled throughout this protected part of the reading, that the celebration of the Lord's Supper, which in early times took place every day, we see that in the early part of Acts, is now repeated every Sunday. So by the time we start in Acts in Jerusalem, they're meeting daily. There's a sense of excitement and expectation, and the church is growing, right there initially. But we see that as it goes out into the non-Jewish world, by the time we get to Acts 20, it's one day a week on the evening of the first day of the week, which would be Sunday, as historically understood. But it's now being repeated every Sunday. From a great scholar, James Dunn, who's done a lot of work both on the background in Jesus's world, as well as the early church, says this: no doubt the small house churches grew by inviting friends, visiting kinfolk, fellow synagogue attenders, neighbors, and colleagues to come to one of the regular meetings or shared meals. How were these churches growing? How was evangelism happening? It was people inviting friends and neighbors and visiting family and workers to a meal together with Jesus's family, where they got to experience his family and hear and see things that they wouldn't see in any other place. In a place that's familiar to everyone, someone's home, but something very, very different happening with a very unique kind of people gathered around a meal. That's a powerful thing, even in our day today. And one of the things to think about is, why have we lost so much of the power and the influence that meals have often been in most cultures? It's one of the things that our driven culture and our work-oriented culture and the productivity culture and the vast majority of churches, a meal is just one of those things you do in the day. Well, we know that meals can form the central feature of what a family life is, because it's not only about our life and sustaining our life, but also the relationships that are formed around that meal much like we have around a Thanksgiving table or a Christmas meal or an Easter meal. Those are times we look forward together. We usually have a large meal together when there's a wedding or a funeral. We still do that stuff, but that importance shouldn't be just for a few times a year or a few times in life. It actually should be on a regular weekly basis for those who are followers of Christ, because it says a lot. We're exploring that a little bit in this session. We see some studies from the 2nd century. This is the century after the apostles, that the church had the practice called sending the Eucharist, the meal of thanksgiving. That's what Eucharist means. And many of you may be familiar from that term as well. They would send it to other house churches in the city. So one house church in Rome sending it to another house church, sent to the poor in the city. So a house church where you had a number of wealthy people in the area of town sending food and resources to poor people in the other part of town because they're part of the same family, though they're meeting in different locations. Might even be sent to other networks. So there's a sense of, Rome sending a gift or something to remind them that we're connected together. We're part of one big global family. And it was common with all the churches through the Roman Empire to collect extra each week and send home with the poor to the churches or the poor in the city. So imagine you're in a house church and you're a relatively wealthy person or well-to-do. You're not worried about where your next meal is coming from or what's going to happen tomorrow. But there in your house church is someone who doesn't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow or has a tremendous burden that health has caused or whatever the case may be. That church assumes a responsibility for the needs of that person and passes that on to them. And that may have been food. The Sunday evening meal may have been the only decent meal many people had in the 1st century. And though that's not our case today, it still says a lot that the most basic thing a person needs in life is what's provided for them. And it comes out of the community, the church family that they are a part of. It's strengthening the family ideal. But it also demonstrates the meal as a defining aspect of their gathering together. When they had the need or shared something, what did they share? A part of their meal by sending it to another house church or sending it even to another city. It means this meal was a key aspect of who they were and what they were doing together. And that's what they shared with one another or with those that were in need. What did these meetings look like? 1 Corinthians 11-14, and I mentioned this last week, that's the picture Paul talks about and is actually critical of the way that they're gathering, not only in the way they're gathering around the meal, the eating portion of the meal, but also around the discussion portion of the meal. These meals had 2 aspects to them: eating together, talking together. That's what church was in the 1st century. And it's quite possible to recreate it. So Lord's Supper is a meal at the beginning of the meeting. In other words, all the eating, the bread, the meal, the cup, that's all one thing. They all go together. And then formal elements like dialogue, discussion around the word together, conversation, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs throughout that, and robust participation by members assembled. In other words, nobody's there just sitting, watching and being quiet. Everybody's engaged and part of it. And that normally is a function of expectation, but often is a function of size as well. You can't get lost in the woodwork if you're, 15 to 20 people meeting in a home. Everyone is going to be able to participate and will feel comfortable doing that in such a way. And I think this is just natural to human beings for most of us. So some of the key elements in 1 Corinthians 11-14, and again, this is describing how they're meeting together. And we're going to look more deeply at this in the next study that we do after this one before the end of the year. But the first part there, they gathered together for the purpose of observing the Lord's Supper, the term being used to symbolize the whole meeting. Again, it's a reference. Lord's Supper means the whole, everything we're doing, not just the bread or the cup, or not just the meal that we're eating, but the whole thing. Everybody understands that's what we're talking about. Before the meal, they broke the bread as a symbol of Christ's body that was broken. And at the end of the meal, with the cup that was shared, symbolizing the new covenant, which was now operational with Christ's churches. This is now happening. We are that people. Defined by what Christ's sacrifice and the new covenant that he's made. And we're gathering in that was what was happening each time to remind them of who they were and what they were and what that meant for them. The meal, though, in essence, a benefactor meal for the poor, was not the main point, but was central to the fellowship of family. So it was not all the energy was not in, having this grand banquet each time. It was enough there to be a meal and to be understood to be a table that gathered everyone together. It was real food. It wasn't a token thing. It was an actual meal that could sustain you, and because it did to some. That may have been the only good meal they had, but it was central to the fellowship and family atmosphere of the meeting. How different when you just sit and talk. How different when the food is put in front of them. And every culture experiences this by and large. Our modern Western culture has lost the importance of it, yet it's not completely gone, and we know and we understand it. We look forward to summer barbecues, and we look forward to birthday parties, and we look forward to, usually there's a meal in the center of it, and it's just part of the way we're wired as human beings. The meal also served to build one-mindedness in the group, experientially fostering relational harmony, thus making their hearts right towards each other and before God as they participated in dialogue around the prophetic word. How do you use your relationship with the people around the table? Is everything good? Is everything harmonious? Are you holding anything against someone? Has there been a conflict? These things are right there and needing to be dealt with, especially as they come to worship God together. It's in that context that people's lives are really changed, and forgiveness offered, and people uniting and getting to know each other and opening up to one another in a way that's safe and fruitful, transformational, changes everyone, and that's why everyone's participation is important. When anyone is missing, it changes the dynamic and the chemistry of things, because that contribution and the resources that person brings into the group by virtue of the Spirit of God in them and their life with Him and the uniqueness that God's designed in all of us, is a massive contribution to this meal and meeting together. Each person was considered to bring a contribution to the meeting, teaching or exhortation from the word, psalm, hymn, spiritual song. We're going to talk more about what some of those things are, but it assumes that you're cultivating a like with God in the week, the times between when you're gathering. And as the Spirit teaches you, as the Spirit leads you, as you learn things from your own reading or from others, you're bringing that, and that may be an encouragement that may have been brought to you that week because someone else across the table needed that from you. And so each one of us can't see the things that we do during the week as mundane or non-important. Everything that we do important. That's why our cultivation and Bible reading and prayer and even meeting together, a coffee with another believer or with non-believers, or engaging in those things, that then becomes the things that we bring and contribute each week that may be a tremendous blessing and have a tremendous impact on others. There was to be order to the time, so it's not chaotic and uncontrolled and so informal that it lasts forever, or nothing happens. And this is what leaders are there to see, to do. It's to sort of make things stay on track. They're moving purposefully, and everybody is being engaged and being built up, and nobody's being left out or ignored or taking control or things like that. So this is the role that leaders will use in that. But leaders would also use the time for communication of concerns to the church and the network of churches, for communication from ministers of the gospel, laboring for the progress of the gospel. So when Paul comes to town, he meets with the churches, and some of them may come together in one place, in one of the larger homes or something like that, to hear Paul's in town, what's happening, what happened in this, we heard about this, but let's hear from him firsthand. So you have a minister of the gospel coming, they're partnering with him. They're interested in what happens in the next city or in the next country or the next culture. And so this is one of the other ways that kept the network together, the way these kind of leaders like Paul and his team moved around among the churches. And the meeting was open to others beyond the local church. There were visitors there. There were non-believers there. There were people who had probably heard about Christ and probably talked with their friends and the neighbors about it, but they weren't quite sure. And they wanted to see it for themselves. And they had enough of an orientation to come in and not be shocked or surprised, but sort of really happily surprised and happily impressed with what it's exactly the way you described it. And I hear and I see the gospel, the good news of Jesus being acted out right in front of me, and people who talk a certain way and treat one another. And I saw these people come together around a situation that was not going well, or forgiveness being offered. That's where people are being drawn into, that there's a different way of being a human being, and there's a different way of meeting with people. There's a different way of understanding God and following him. And others invited into that meeting, again, with the cultivation of those relationships. It could have been, I suppose, a wide open door. Hey, there's this group of people that were meeting over there in a home, and you could walk into it. I'm sure people would be welcome to do that. But by and large, it's through the relationships with those people in an ongoing way. And you can see as that happens, you quickly outgrow a house and you'd have to go into another one. Or, you can see how fast spontaneous expansion can start to happen as people get connected to this meeting, to this gathering. So again, the shape of the meeting, it's in a family household environment. It's around the fellowship of the meal. It's celebrative. It's authentic. It's personal. It's relational. It's the real deal. There's no pretense. It's no putting on airs. This is who we are, and it's very basic, and it's very down to earth. It's interactive, so it's not one person controlling and talking the whole time. It's everybody involved, even the kids, and everybody's there as a family. And it may seem chaotic and loud, but that's the way it happens when family gets together. You all know what that looks like. And it had some structure and formality. In other words, there was an order to things, and things were expected to progress beginning to end, but not in a highly controlled and domineering, active, passive kind of way. We're going to be looking more specifically at what one of these meetings look like in this little book that most of you have gotten, Going to Church in the First Century. And if you still need it, I can get probably a printed copy to you this Sunday. Let me know that, because I want to make sure everybody's reading this before we come together around our Lord's meal on October the 10th. So we're going to focus on this and actually look at what one of these meetings look like, and live in it for a while. And we may do that through, after we have our meal together, actually reading through it together, almost like a live reading or a place so that we're all engaging in it, and maybe stop and talk about things for just a few minutes here and there. So keep that in mind, and you can even start working through it. It'll give you a real, it's like watching a YouTube video of what one of the house churches might look like. And that would be a great thing if somebody produced something like that. The Didache is a 2nd century document that indicates how they were meeting. Even the generation after the apostles was still in this fashion. So there's a lot of research that's been done on that. And the Didache is an actual document that exists from the 2nd century. And we see right in there the elements, about a 3 or 4 hour meeting with the meal, a teaching beginning, the breaking of bread, the meal, informal things, formal things, the passing of the cup, a teaching ending of songs and prayers. So we see a framework there from a document that we have actually in hand today in the 2nd century, from the 2nd century, that indicates how past the New Testament generation, the next generation, we're meeting in a similar way. What was the size of these meetings? What are we talking about here? Probably a typical house, maximum number would be 50. That's a really big, wealthy person's home, and it's probably a big outdoor courtyard. More probably 30 to 40 in an upper middle class home. Wealthy homeowners had dining halls with attached gardens, so there might be a lot of garden outside meeting than you could, and the Mediterranean world would allow you to do that, except for the rainy, cold winter months. There are 3 examples given: 330, 360, and 1,135. Imagine a person with a large estate could gather that many people. Probably not weekly, but that was the possibilities there of pulling people together, but again, around a meal. We don't know how large the homes of people like Cornelius, Simon, Gaius, Crispus or Stephanus, Priscilla and Aquila, Philemon, Apphia, and Archippus might have been. But in some of them, we know they were living probably in an apartment building like Priscilla and Aquila in Rome. And that's the example that we'll see next week in the reading here in Going to Church in the First Century. So keep that in mind. And that's probably several families, but probably no more than 30, if even that. So small, significant, authentic. Why was the meal so important? Well, it visualized the church as the family of God. So the church is a family of families. The way they gather needs to reflect that. It brought a natural fellowship element into the shape of the meeting. You put food in the middle and it changes things. It put the kerygma at the heart of the meeting, the bread and the cup with a meal like Jesus shared with his early followers, his disciples, reminded everyone that this is Jesus's meal. This is what Jesus gave us to do together. And it's about him and what he's done for us. It's a constant reminder, and we need to be constant reminded as people, not just once or twice a year. You know, how many of us will say, wish we could be Christmas every day of the year? Well, for the church, every week is a celebration of Jesus, every week. And that helps even for us personally and in our families to form every day as a celebration of our life in Jesus. It immediately formed the new community into a benefactor community. Hey, is there somebody who has a need around us, or is there a neighbor of ours that we can help together? So it created an environment where that kind of stuff could come to the table right away. So-and-so needs prayer. So-and-so needs help. We need to pull together with these other house churches around us in order to meet this need in our neighborhood or our part of the city. It was simple and universal. Anybody, anywhere could practice this, and it promoted ingenious networking. There's a question that I asked there: why? Why was this so effective in being able to be reproduced? The simplicity and universality of it is a key aspect of it. Why did it all change? Why did we move from this meal that we're looking at in the New Testament to a little ceremony, usually tacked on at the end of a large gathering of people in rows, listening to a speaker or someone on stage, to passing around a little cracker and a little cup around every so often, once a month, once a quarter, twice a year, whatever the case may be. That's something very different than what was going on there. It's a response to this in the a book. I have this book, and it's interesting to get a hold of it about a number of things, questioning, how we've come to do things and how it's so different from the early church. But it says here, in the first and second centuries, the early Christians called the Lord's Supper the love feast, the agape meal. At that time, they took the bread and the cup in the context of a festive meal. It was like Thanksgiving, a celebration. But around the time of Tertullian, this is in the second century, the bread and the cup began to be separated from the meal. So they took the bread at the beginning and the cup at the ending and took it out of a meal context, and it kind of was something by itself. By the late second century, the separation was complete. By the fourth century, the love feast was prohibited among Christians. The church leaders actually outlawed it and moved completely away from the model of Jesus and his apostles, and for a number of reasons. But that was a wrong move. And that move out of the house or out of the meal into an official public meeting space with a professional or powerful people leading things changed everything in the dynamic of the church by the time of Constantine the Great and beyond. And we still live with the effects of it today. With the abandonment of the meal, the terms breaking of bread and Lord's Supper disappeared. So we're no longer talking about when we meet together, we talk about a service, or we talk about a meeting, or we talk about a ceremony or something like that. We don't use it, or when we gather to break bread, and we understand that's the way we describe what we do together, the whole thing. So the common term now for the truncated ritual, in other words, just the sharing of the bread and the cup, the cracker and the little cup of juice, was the Eucharist. The Lord's Supper was no longer a community event. It is something individuals did in rows and passed it down from chair to chair. It was a priestly ritual to be watched from a distance. So even in other traditions, you see the priest does some things up there, and then we come up and take part of it one by one. We don't necessarily do it together, and it doesn't remind us at all that we're a family. I can go up front or I can not go up front. There's no sense of participating and celebrating together. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, there was an increasing sense of awe and dread associated with the table where the sacred Eucharist was celebrated. The focus comes around the death of Jesus, and really that alone, not his resurrection and the new life and the new family that he's created. So it sort of becomes a pity party for Jesus that we remember when we have this bread and this cup. It has that element, but it's not only that element. It's not a wake for Jesus. We don't reenact Jesus's funeral every time we come together around the bread and the cup. However, because of the way it's been formed over the years, it has tended to have that feeling to it. It's not celebrative. It's not family. It's not what we see described here. Is something very, very different, somber and glum. Around the 10th century, the meaning of the word body changed in Christian literature. Consequently, the Lord's Supper became far removed from the idea of the church coming together to celebrate the breaking of bread. All this gave rise to the doctrine of transubstantiation, where the thought is, or the belief is, you're actually eating Jesus's body. So be careful. You got to have not just really, really dangerous if you do that in the wrong way. And all this gave, this was worked out from the 11th through the 13th century, particularly in the Catholic tradition, and it still goes on today to this in that way. Very different from the way we're seeing the meals of those first 3 centuries. While contemporary Protestant Christians have discarded the Catholic notion that the Lord's Supper is a sacrifice, we don't kill Jesus again every time we get together, and that's generally what the priest is doing up there talking about, so that it becomes Jesus's actual body and actual blood when we share it together. But they've continued to embrace the practice of the supper. Observe a Lord's Supper, often called Holy Communion, which again is a totally different way of reminding. There's really nothing communing about it at all. And the holiness is one of just scaring us all to become right with the Lord again, for the most part, which again, not saying that not something that should happen, but it is something that shouldn't be the only thing happening. You'll observe that it's a bite-sized cracker or a shot glass. It's removed from the meal. The mood is somber and glum. People are called to examine themselves before they take the elements, and may or may not participate in it. And that's just an individual decision, and it's left up to them, rather than a sense of being part of a family. And that if I'm not right with the Lord, it's because I'm affecting the relationships here. And now's the time to be reminded that that's what I'm part of, and God invites you back into it through Christ and the Spirit and the others. But if you're in if you do have something that needs to be worked out, by all means, work it out before you sit down and eat together. I have something to say to everyone. I have been not living as I ought to, or I have this thing with this brother. It's an opportunity for those things to happen, not to avoid those things, or to be, it's an encouragement. Like the Catholic priest, many pastors will sport clerical robes. So it becomes this special things, and with all kinds of rituals and things associated with it. Again, so far removed from the simple gathering around a meal that we saw earlier on. This is all medieval Catholicism through and through. We've just changed we've taken the bread and cup and think about it differently, but the whole system is still really functioning that way. That hasn't really changed much since the Reformation. Lastly, and I'm ending here, these are the questions you'll have that we'll consider tomorrow. And again, we'll have a follow-up conversation on Thursday night and on Zoom, where you can just allow these thoughts to continue to reflect on them through the week and read again and come with new insights on Thursday night. And I encourage all of you to jump in on that. Again, those have been really, really helpful to really ask specific questions where all of us can share in that. And I am recording them so that we can make those available to everyone. I probably won't put those recordings on YouTube. We'll make those links available to you in a more private way, so that it's not out there in the wider world. Just seems wise to do that, but it's where we can talk really and at close range about these things. So what is the role of the meal in the simple gatherings of the churches? Try to explain that in your own words. What do we mean by branding? Is that the right word to use? Is that a good term? to describe what Paul was doing in the churches. How so? Think about that. What did this way of meeting? Why did this way of meeting promote ingenious networking? That was stated. How does that work? Because it looks like this is an aspect of spontaneous expansion. This is how the church grew and grew and grew and multiplied. So why does the author of this paper say that? How is this different from the way most of us have traditionally experienced communion? Does it matter? Does it matter how we do this? Do the things that we've looked at today or we read about today matter? Why? Let's talk about that. And how would church meetings shaped around a meal make a difference to anyone who's not a follower of Jesus in our world today? Think about friends and family and coworkers who don't know the Lord and aren't really interested in following him, perhaps, but through your conversations and your relationships and things that you see happening, they actually get invited into one of these types of meetings. How would that make a difference? I've had experiences with that, but think through and, the relations that you have and the relationships you're cultivating with non-believing friends and neighbors and family and coworkers or whoever, and think about a difference that if they were introduced apart from your sharing in your life, this is how they were introduced with Jesus as the next step. Why would that make a difference? And would it? Have you ever had such an experience or heard about that? So that's where we're going on Sunday. So I appreciate the time that you've taken to watch this, and we'll get it out to you as soon as I can. Look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 10 a.m. And again, we'll make a Zoom link available for the group, the small simple church that meets with me, the Charis Simple Church, so that those of you who are not able to get with us physically can still meet with us online. God bless and have a great Saturday.